So thank you, Dennis, very much, and thank you for coming here today. We appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
For our listeners, I'd like to give a brief biographical sketch and then ask you to amplify, correct, or add to it in terms of how your upbringing and career form the way you see environmental law and policy, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you grew up in the Pacific Northwest and attended Stanford University. You enrolled at Harvard for postgraduate work, but left after being selected by Senator Gaylord Nelson to be the coordinator of the first Earth Day. That first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, had millions of participants and celebrants across the country in thousands of universities, high schools, and communities. Following the success of the first Earth Day, you founded the Earth Day Network. You expanded the network to more than 180 nations, and Earth Day is now the world's most widely observed secular holiday. During the Carter administration, you became head of the Solar Energy Research Institute, which is now known as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. You went back to school and completed a law degree at Stanford and went to become an adjunct professor of engineering in that university and litigator with the law firm Cooley Godward. In 1992, you became president of the Bullitt Foundation in Seattle and continued to be a leader in environmental and energy policy. You've been a fellow at and served on the boards of many leading institutions in environmental and energy policy, and you received the National Jefferson Awards Medal for Outstanding Public Service, as well as the highest awards bestowed by the Sierra Club, the Humane Society of the United States, the National Wildlife Federation, the National Resources Council of America, and many other groups. Time magazine has named you as a hero of the planet. As you think back on that long history, how did you get involved in and interested in environmental issues in the first place?
Well, there are two answers to that, and they're both correct. I grew up in one of the most stunningly beautiful parts of the United States, in the Columbia River Gorge in the Pacific Northwest. I spent my summers chasing around through forests that were almost primeval. My father worked for a paper mill in the town. Most everybody worked for the paper mill in the town that I grew up in. It was a historic mill town. And not only were they clear-cutting the forests around us, but there were no kinds of air pollution controls at all. So they poured out hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide completely unconstrained. They had liquor spills into the river that would sometimes, you go down there in the morning and 10,000 fish dead floating on in the slough. And there was this contrast between something that was pristine and beautiful and something that represented progress. And there was almost a toughness about it in the community. I mean, you didn't complain about waking up every morning with a sore throat. That was the smell of prosperity. But there was nagging at me a sense that we should be able to have paper without everybody being sick. And this stuff was so bad that it precipitated out as acid rain and pitted the automobiles. And it says something, I guess, about our values back then, that there was a formal protest and people got the mill to set up large showers, so at the end of your shift you drove your car through a shower, but we didn't do anything about the stuff going into our own lungs. Then the other big, the point where all of this kind of crystallized for me, I went to a National Science Foundation Institute after my junior year in high school, not because I knew anything about the subject, ecology. I didn't even know what it was before I went there. It was just a chance to get out of this little town. And, we used Odom's Principles of Ecology as our text. Yeah, I was 16 years old, like every 16-year-old. I goofed off a good deal that summer. We were studying dragonflies. I was chasing this very attractive young girl from Michigan around. But pumped up for the test, basically mastered the essence of it, and more or less forgot about it. After my sophomore year in college, suffering an incredible Weltschmerz, I went out hitchhiking around the world for a few years. I was deeply concerned about all kinds of things, ranging from the 50,000 nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union and the United States had pointed at one another, to civil rights problems in the American South, to what have you. It was just a sense that the world was in bad shape, seeming to be getting worse, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I was in the proverbial quest for meaning. One night in the middle of what is now Namibia, I sort of found it. I was at a crossroads. I went out over the hill and had certainly the closest thing I've ever had to what people would think of as a vision. And it somehow tied together. I mean, it's when people have visions. I was tired, I was hungry, it had been impossibly hot that day, it was incredibly cold that night. It was, you know, Old Testament stuff. And somehow those principles of ecology popped up into my mind at a time that I was traipsing through Africa, and I began to think that they applied to everything that was out there in the world, including all of the great apes, except what you might think of as a third sort of particularly clever subspecies of chimpanzee, Homo sapiens, and that some of our problems, in fact a great many of them that related back to that paper mill and other things, came out of our failure to build a modern society that embraced many of those principles. And I was caught up in this, 20-year-old's excitement. I was going to write Das Kapital, or The Wealth of Nations, the new great construct. But we had no vocabulary for it, but it was the idea of what we now call urban ecology or industrial ecology. And I woke up, I actually got up, I stayed awake all night, but got up the following morning finally knowing my direction and came back. And pretty much my life from that night forward was driven by the recognition then that this was something that I wanted to be involved with. And it was almost never asked. I was actually torn. I went back to Stanford, studied with Paul Ehrlich, Don Kennedy, and others who were in that field, was thinking seriously about going into biology or even ecology. But I realized that although I was interested in those issues, what I was most interested in was human behavior and the choices that humans are making in the structuring and organizing of their societies, and that what I wanted to do was to have those basic biological values, but that my contribution, to the extent that I made one, would be in applying them to the law, to politics, to social change.
And so what did you do your undergraduate major in?
Oh, now you're nailing me. I switched 5 times. In the end, mostly having to do with the decision to go to law school and a perhaps erroneous belief that it would be helped by a history major. I switched into history, but at the time, that was a senior year decision. I could have as easily done biology or chemistry or political science. I spent a lot of time in school. In fact, although you say Stanford, I went to Clark, I went to Jochi Daigaku, I went to Denison University, I went to a bunch of places before I finally graduated.
How do you see science, law, and this human behavior issue really working out in environmental issues? What's the role, in particular, what's the role of law in all of that from your perspective?
There are a number of really important ways that the law intersects with the things that I care most about. To start with, perhaps the most obvious, the law sets the ground rules for how the economy operates. It tells you what behavior is acceptable and what is prescribed. In the course of doing that and in other ways, it can tell you what the price signals should be to internalize external values, whether they be costs or benefits. There was a time that for a quarter of a century where that was how the American Congress operated. There was certainly the burst from 1970 through 1974 where we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, on and on. We were sort of unstoppable and created, if you will, the framework of modern environmentalism. Not without its errors, Superfund, for example, but by and large, pretty good decisions. Now we've reached something where it's just about impossible to get anything through the national legislative context. But still, law, broadly viewed, gives us things like renewable portfolio standards that create the context within which utilities place money into renewable energy resources. It gives us land use planning decisions. One of the things that I care most about is getting distributed solar energy applications in cities. Well, it will be the law that tells you how you can do that without having something that gets between you and the sun, leaving you with the most expensive roof in the city, but no ability to get any power out of it because they don't operate if there's shade. Solar access law, which interestingly my wife wrote a book about for the Environmental Law Institute in 1978 or so. The progress on that, I should say, has been limited. There's such a law in Salt Lake City. I think there's sort of one in Colorado, but not too much progress. And then the other way that it interacts is that in the end, a whole lot of what happens when you're introducing innovative new technologies or ways to do things is with the cleverness of the legal community to figure out how to tweak various kinds of subsidies, tax breaks, innovative ways to structure corporations and compensation plans, innovative ways to structure deals. When the solar industry was operating entirely out of people's garages, and it was a bunch of hardworking people scrambling to try to save the world, it didn't have very high-powered legal representation, and in the end, in the Reagan administration, when the decision came to crush it, it was pretty easily crushed. Today, when it's robustly funded here and especially elsewhere by large corporations investing in startups, by venture capital funds making some pretty big bets, by sovereign funds investing in their domestic industries and what have you, it's now getting very high-priced legal talent, and sometimes it's now running into the same kinds of difficulties that the natural gas industry and the utility industry and others have come into, the Enron problems, where they get a little bit too clever for their own good. But it is a highly competitive enterprise. This is not kumbaya, it's all energy, let's just go out and have everybody do their part. These are fiercely competitive industries, and you have to have high-powered advocates on your side in the legal community, or people will use everything out there to your disadvantage.
Wonderful. We can go back now to the 1970s and starting with Earth Day. What was the experience like setting that up as a 25-year-old? How did you enjoy that?
It was extraordinarily high-pressured. I mean, literally, you hit the ground running as fast as you could run, and the pace just kept accelerating. The initial thought that Senator Nelson had was for an environmental teach-in on college campuses across the country. That would be, we thought, pretty easy to do. There were a whole lot of college students who'd had a lot of organizing experience, the anti-war movement and other things, and we thought that we could just plug into that network. And I managed to get several very good organizers from around the country to come in and be part of what this new wave would be that was going to try to sort of profoundly restructure the way that the industrial enterprise operated. The interest on most college campuses was modest, and where there was interest, it was often, and I don't mean to be dismissive, but in 1969, the campus representatives of the National Wildlife Federation were often not the people who were the most skilled organizers on campus. And it just seemed to be stalling out, and I was afraid that this was going to be not much. But we analyzed the mail that had come in, and the mail was overwhelmingly from two big categories. One was teachers, mostly 6 to 12, grades 6 to 12 teachers, who saw this as something that they really wanted to be engaged with. It's a way to get their kids into science. It was almost a little bit like, this will be our Sputnik. And the other was sort of 25 to 35-year-old women, mostly, virtually all college educated, and virtually all stay-at-home moms with a kid or two, who had seen various social movements come and go. They didn't get involved with them for various reasons, sometimes having to do with their husbands' careers. This is something that really engaged them, tugged at their souls in some way, and maybe it seemed safe, I don't know. For whatever reason, they jumped in. And in the course of making the decision to basically get it off of college campuses, and to the extent that students, once we had a movement going, decided to pile onto it, to steer them off their campuses and into the surrounding communities, and to worry about freeways that were going to cut through inner city areas, and polluting smokestacks, and sewage waste flooding into swimming holes, and that sort of stuff. Don't hold a bunch of seminars and have people come and talk to you on campus. Be engaged. That was a profound shift that suddenly allowed it to catch on fire. We had an advertising executive from New York who volunteered to run some ads for us, and we decided to announce this shift with a full-page ad in the New York Times, and he came down with something which was E-Day, Ecology Day, Environment Day, Green Day, Earth Day, and we had these things laid out. We brought in some pizza and beer, tried to figure out which one. It was Earth Day, the beginning, and then a whole bunch of gobbledygook underneath. We would choose the prose depending upon what the title was. In the end, it was unanimous. Earth Day just resonated for all of us, went with that, and the ad paid for itself like 4 times over, which never happens with New York Times ads. And then a bunch of magazines, publications, newspapers of various kinds picked it up and ran it for free in their papers, and the money just kept gushing in from this advertisement. So then we were off and running, and then you have all of the problems that all movements do with various people whose egos get in the way of things or have their own agendas that have nothing to do with what you're about. But we tried to keep it consciously a very big tent. If you cared about the basic set of values that we were proposing, there was room for you in this movement.
What do you think, as you look back on that arc from 1970 until today, were the most important accomplishments along the way?
Well, I guess I think of the accomplishments as a fairly coherent package. Initially, it was a transformation of the public consciousness. In 1969, if you'd asked the average person what the environment meant, they wouldn't have had an answer. Some husky fraction of people who graduated from college and taken a psychology course would say that the environment is a thing other than heredity that determines personality. I mean, it didn't have any of the connotations. By 1970, there was not only a essentially universal understanding of what we meant by the term, but 80% of the people described themselves as environmentalists. I mean, it was one of those profound tipping points in society. Second, there was the raft of legislation that came after that. Third was a political shift that occurred, began as part of our Dirty Dozen campaign in 1970, and particularly when we knocked out George Fallon, the chairman of the House Public Works Committee, on what was clearly an environmental issue, a freeway in Baltimore. A young guy named Paul Sarbanes challenged him in a primary and beat him. And when the chairman of the House Pork Committee gets defeated by environmentalists, and I don't mean we got all the votes, but we got 5 or 6% of the votes that were clearly on the basis of that environmental issue, which was more than the margin of victory, which Sarbanes acknowledged. Suddenly, things were very different in the way that we were. In 1968, there had been efforts to pass a Clean Air Act, and they'd really gone nowhere. In 1970, the Clean Air Act was unstoppable, passing by voice votes. That was an important shift. And ultimately, I guess, it changed a great deal about the way that America is organized, about the legal structure within which business operates, the ethics of people and communities and families. We have tens and tens of millions of people all over America, and I'll ignore for the moment the world today, who for environmental reasons choose to eat certain foods and not eat other foods, to have certain kinds of automobiles and not have other kinds, to insulate their houses, to have 1 or 2 children instead of 7 or 8 children, though they might like it. I mean, profound decisions made for a set of values that in 1969 would have been kind of fringe values. And now are quite definitely mainstream. And finally, all of those science teachers produced a whole bunch of environmental scientists who began to measure things and make it possible to account for things, and began to produce such things as the valuation of nature's services and make you recognize that in a whole series of decisions we're making as a society, the things that are actually being totaled up and constituting the basis for the decision are smaller in terms of their dollar value than the things that we're completely ignoring in the process of making the decision. And So now when we talk about the health of Puget Sound, when we talk about ocean acidification, when we talk about the pros and cons of really vigorous ozone pollution, it's got data behind it that is very defensible. It may not persuade people whose ideology doesn't leave them open to being persuaded, but within that array of people who are looking for the truth with very solid research behind it, we now have a degree of sophistication that simply did not exist anywhere in 1969.
That's such an enormous level of accomplishment to take from 1969 till today. What do you think's left to be done moving forward?
Having just raved a bit about the sophistication of what we know today, the ignorance is, even among sophisticated people, leaves a huge void that probably will always remain. We will always just be making progress toward more perfect understandings. But on almost any issue that you look at, there are error boundaries that are wider than I would like them to be, and we would like to get that stuff narrowed. There's interesting research to be done in new energy technologies. As you move into nanotechnologies for solar conversion, you can now, in the laboratory and in very small devices, get levels of efficiency that were believed to be scientifically impossible 10 years ago, before we figured out how to basically capture that much of the sunlight with this totally redevised nanostructure. And similarly in the energy realm, levels of research on storage technologies, batteries, flywheels, smart grids, what have you, ways to combat all of the vulnerabilities that brings from cyber terrorism and other kinds of terrorism. And there's just a gazillion things that need to be done if we're going to be shifting from, as we're shifting, we don't have any choice about this, from a fossil-fueled, largely centralized energy system to a society that relies predominantly upon distributed, renewable, safe, non-polluting, unbreakable sources. I suppose at a more profound level, in terms of what needs to be done today, is that the environmental movement, to the extent that it still exists as a movement, needs to become revitalized and more inclusive. The most important things maybe that we did as decisions in 1970 was not to set the bar too high for coming in. You had to be prepared to be part of this, to share the values, but there was room for farmers, and hell, we got most of our money from labor unions, of all things. We had room for a whole lot of companies that were doing interesting, innovative things. That's not to say that it was, y'all come. I mean, we turned down contributions from Exxon and from others that had behaved irresponsibly, but it was, we erred on the side of inclusivity. You know, if you go to an evangelical church today, the parking spaces in front of the church are reserved for first-timers, and you walk up to the door and people throw their arms around you and say, "Welcome, brother, I haven't seen you before. Come on in, I'd like you to meet the pastor." It's just this vast, inclusive sort of thing. You go to a typical meeting of environmentalists and you sort of have to prove that you took a couple of graduate level courses in whatever subject is under discussion, or you're kind of a non-participant. And, you know, in a democracy where I think it's on the order of 2/3 of all people don't go to college, and I don't think even half finish high school, we have to be able to explain what it is that we're talking about in ways that resonate in bowling alleys and Elks clubs, and not just in seminars. You know, in the first Earth Day, people were railing about poison. Today, they yap about polychlorinated biphenyls. Poison is a more persuasive term.
Are there things the environmental, well, you mentioned that the environmental movement may not even exist cohesively today. Where do you see sustainability going? Is that the continuation of the environmental movement? Is it a term that actually has meaning to it? Where do you see that going?
Well, sustainability does have behind it all, in theory, a relatively rigorous definition of passing on to future generations a world with at least as many options as we had. That, like so many things, has been sort of corrupted by overuse by some of the clever advertisers who are trying to do things with it. But I think there's something there still that is worth holding on to for as long as it continues to have value. I mean, it is a profound difficulty that as soon as we get anything, there was a period where green just had all sorts of panache. It too became corrupted. What sustainability has tended to focus on in people's consciousness is the sustainability of a world in which human beings have all of the options available to them that they had before. And when they're talking about those options, they're not often talking about the options to go out and view wildlife where it is in its natural state. I think for all kinds of reasons, including that we just don't know enough about the planet to allow big chunks of life to disappear because we don't know what functions they may be performing. And also on some basic moral, if it exists, it probably has some right to continue to exist, at least within some parameters. As our species continues to grow in numbers and to leap forward in terms of prosperity, we're crowding everything else out. And concepts of sustainability often tend to ignore that. I'll get myself in real trouble here, but everybody makes these mistakes that come back to haunt you later. In the women's movement, when they began trying to get past legal obstacles to abortion, even cases of rape and incest, or simply that you are not able at that point to have a baby and to care for it and to nurture it in a way that will make it a productive citizen, the word that they chose was choice. And we've now had 30 years where progressives have been aligned with the concept that it is a woman's right to choose whether or not to have children. And it's basically unquestioned within the circles that I mostly hang out in. If everyone chooses to have 8 kids and they're Americans, we're over. In fact, if they choose to have 3 kids and they're Americans, we don't have too much of a fuse out in front of us. And in the early days, everyone was saying, well, the real population problem is that it's Americans because of all of our consumption. It's the American versus the 40 Indians or the 30 Chinese. And I got in genuine fights over that, saying, well, yes, if Chinese peasants are prepared to have their great-great-great-great-grandchildren be Chinese peasants too, but I'm not sure happiness extends in that direction. And I think I was more right than wrong. Even Chinese peasants don't want to be Chinese peasants anymore. And there's this explosive desire, because people have seen what life is like when you have a higher degree of economic comfort, that I don't think we need to have the wild-eyed, we can't have the wild-eyed conspicuous consumption that characterizes the West, but there is a certain basic level of living that is natural for people to be, is required for people to have a satisfactory life with elements of education and human rights and comfort and productivity and creativity. This is one of those places where the data swing an awful lot with different sorts of assumptions, but you can build a decent case that if you want a world in which every citizen has the material ability to have the level of income and wealth of a contemporary Swede, that the optimal world human population is on the order of 2 to 2.5 billion people. Well, when you're up in the 7 billion range, that suggests you can't get there. And if you get up to the 9 to 10 billion range, that means that either you're going to continue in perpetuity to have a few 100 million people who are extraordinarily well off and a lot who are not, or else everybody at a level of life that is very substantially less than contemporary Swedes. So I mean, I guess this is a really convoluted way to answer your question, to say an issue that we have been too cowardly to address frontally because it's created a backlash among minority communities, a backlash in immigration officials, a backlash among liberals is population. But sooner or later, we've got to figure out a way to make people who care about population in the abstract, and that's a lot of people, recognize that we're really talking about babies, and you've got to have limits on babies if you're having limits on population. I say that as a guy who went to a family gathering to a sister-in-law who had 4 kids and showed up clearly pregnant, and without even thinking said, "Oh my God, Alexandra, another one?" It was an incredibly chilly Christmas.
So you mentioned some mistake or shortcoming in the sense of population control. Are there other mistakes or things you would have done differently or think the movement should have done differently in the past 40 years?
Oh, sure. I mean, you can't ever be involved in anything that is huge and complicated with myriad assets and liabilities that you don't go back and say, wow, I wish we could have done that differently, though they have their own organic forms. And Lord knows, I may well be dead wrong on some things. I personally am not at all enamored of the cap-and-trade approach. And not even for sulfur, which everyone calls the great triumph. I think it still places some disproportionate burdens on some, and if you could only limit it to air sheds, maybe not, but you can't. And so, but when you talk about carbon, I'm in that very small minority, I guess, that would like to have, in my ideal world, an upstream cap, an auction with no trading, and in a less ideal world, just a simple carbon tax. But we have somehow found ourselves in a society where that cannot happen, and so I guess you do the best you can with whatever levers may be available to you. I don't think that there are any laws that are unflawed, and when you then think about how you would fix them, we're now in this super polarized situation where if you bring anything up for reconsideration, you have a very decent chance that it will be gutted. I mean, I don't know if you're filming this for time and eternity, and so maybe I hope I'm talking about a narrow little period in American life, but there was this, you know, Lisa Jackson was snubbed pretty badly by Barack Obama in ways that caused her to lose face in a lot of circles. A very distinguished professor of environmental law at the University of Texas called on her to resign, to which the response is, who in the world do you think they can confirm to replace her? I mean, it's just impossible to get anything through this Senate. Yeah, we're in a very tough period, and part of that has to do with not communicating effectively with the common man, and part of it has to do with the nature of the kinds of people who tend to become involved with these issues, myself included, which is to say we tend to venture hypotheses, look for some proof for them, never are absolutely certain that we're right, tend on the balance to think we should do this. And on the other side are people who have absolute confidence that the world was created intact 6,000 years ago, and that is, you know, absolute fact, and if you don't believe that, you are going to burn in perdition forever. And there's some huge number of people who are not going to be digging into the nuances of issues. They have a rough time trying to make enough money to keep body and soul together. They're looking for somebody to play a leadership role that they can have confidence in. It's easier to be confident in someone who is enormously confident, unquestioning themselves, and you just get yourself caught up in this, where our people tend to be enormously tentative, and they're arrayed against people who are, in their own incredibly simplistic ways, absolutely sure of themselves. I don't know how you get around any of that, and it is possibly what could be the fatal flaw of democracy in a globalized economy wrestling with technologically and scientifically difficult and sophisticated issues. I mean, Jefferson was right about newspapers, but it applies to all forms of educational communication. You've got to not just have the papers, you have to have an aroused citizenry capable of understanding the issues and doing the work to understand them. Ironically, today, and again, this is a narrow little window, there are some countries in the world where the governments basically function like corporations. And ironically, the heirs of Mao are probably the clearest example of that. The people who did best as undergraduates go to the very best graduate schools. Those that went to the best graduate schools and did best get into government. Those who compete very effectively are marshaled much as they are in General Electric up to ever higher levels of authority, and in the end are selected not by a democratic process, but by their peers to figure out who is most competent to handle this thing. And it produces a government that's dominated by engineers, scientists, and economists who are wrestling with a bunch of issues that frankly most members of the U.S. Congress don't bring very much sophistication to. And I am profoundly worried about that, particularly since China has no great commitment to what I think is the most important of America's contribution to the world of ideas, the Bill of Rights and the rule of law. But we're in a very troubling period.
I was struck that you mentioned at the beginning that some of the political power and the impact of Earth Day was behind winning an election and causing change at that level. Today, there's no bipartisanship whatsoever, and we've gone 180 degrees. How did that happen? Why do you think that's occurred, and is there any way out of that you see?
Okay, I mean, I'll try to do this in a couple of minutes, but it's really a year-long seminar. The heart of it, I believe, was Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. When environmental issues were bipartisan, it was because the Republicans had a bunch of people like George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller and John Lindsay and Chuck Percy and Pete McCloskey, none of whom were from the Deep South, because the Deep South was rapidly segregationist, and that was part of the great Roosevelt coalition in the Democratic Party. Nixon paid attention to what happened in the Goldwater election, where he cracked a great many southern states, and Nixon decided that he could flip the entire South to the Republican Party with the appropriate set of things, assuming he could neutralize George Wallace. And in the process, had to fight for control of the soul of the party against all of those folks on the other side, a great many of whom, McCloskey and Lindsay and Don Riegel and others, actually left the party. And in the end, he sacrificed that wing of the Republican Party that was out there on these issues for us. And I don't know how to get it back. It's but a way to address the issue in this thing where now that the country is split along divisional lines and we have genuinely red states and genuinely blue states, is that you can still move issues in a sort of non-democratic way by having an interest group that cares so passionately about something that they put everything else on the back burner. And if you are wrong about, and fill in the blank, gun control, the integrity of Israel's borders, abortion, there are these button issues for button voters that if that's wrong, you cannot get our vote, you can't get $1 out of us. We don't have that anywhere on the environmental side. I loathe that as a gross perversion of what democracy is supposed to be and how it's supposed to function. I also didn't like the way that Tammany Hall functioned. I didn't like the way that a whole bunch of the reforms that came in functioned in the Roosevelt era. Democracy is by its nature an imperfect beast and sometimes a deeply flawed beast, but I think given how dire the situation is, we probably now ought to create something that is not a good, well, in addition to the good solid League of Conservation voters and the Green PACs who weigh up scorecards and on balance try to do this. And frankly, the last refuge of affirmative action in America is if you're a Republican seeking an endorsement from the League of Conservation voters. Much, much, much easier there than if you're a Democrat seeking an endorsement. But we need to I think maybe develop some zealots, and enough of them to begin to tilt elections. People who will say that if you are wrong on climate and the need to shift to a totally different approach to energy, then you're not going to get our vote regardless of how you are on every other issue. I'm not sure whether that's possible, but I suspect it is more possible than any of the other kinds of approaches that I've heard for operating in today's world to get change made in a timely fashion. In the long run, I would like to think that opening the doors of the big tent again, bringing in these people who are listening to Rush Limbaugh and forming their views of the world from he and Glenn Beck and the others, talk with them, get to know them, go bowling with them, let them understand that you're a person who cares about things. I think there is a way, because I'm convinced that we are right on these issues, that we can convince a majority of that. But we've made no progress in it in the last dozen years, and those are a dozen years that are utterly wasted while carbon dioxide and other climate change-inducing gases have just been accumulating.
In talking to some people about the start of the environmental movement, foundations often come up in the history. They helped fund resources for the future, helped start NRDC. We're there with the LI starting. You're now with the foundation and you're part of the Environmental Grantmakers Association. What's the role of foundations in the environmental movement? How important are they? What's their actual function?
I think they're probably far more important and influential today than they were in the early days. There were just a handful of foundations that made a handful of grants that, in retrospect, were really very small. Though it came at a vital time. The Ford Foundation grant went to NRDC. It's interesting. The board had two choices, either to fund our little group that came out of Earth Day called Environmental Action, or this group of litigators. And we made a huge tactical error in that we decided to have a self-governing organization sort of modeled on a co-op where we were the board, the staff and the board. NRDC brought in a group of very influential people, including very high-powered attorneys, most of whom were well-networked at Ford Foundation. And they decided that that's where the grant should go, and they've built it into a powerhouse. And they've also started with probably more talented people than I and we were. They really did have wonderful folks who are still heading the organization. Today there are some huge foundations that are weighing into this, some of them playing forceful roles, and some of them I think probably very creative, clever work going on that but for them would not be done. In this sphere of movement building, I still cling to the idea that I'd like this to come from the people. I'd like it to reflect not just what a board of trustees meeting 3 times a year, no matter how carefully selected, does, but that you rely principally upon your membership, and that foundations come in for innovative things. They come in to allow you to try something that you would never be able to experiment with but for the foundation. But that they're not there just as your base of support each year, and as a consequence you become so reliant upon them that when they sneeze you get pneumonia. And there are a great many people who approach foundations with, what can I do? What do I have to do to get your money? That's just not how it should operate. Having said that, in the innovative side, I think that there are some enormously useful things that some foundations have done and that they should do. Because it consumed my entire afternoon today, I'll say that what we're doing at the moment, not in our grant making, although it's a part of our grant making as well, but that it's a mission-related investment, is to build the greenest office building in the world. So that in cloud-covered Seattle, we will have a 6-story building that gets as much electricity from a photovoltaic array on its roof each year as the building uses in 6 stories. And you know, you have the same roof on a 6-story building as on a 1-story building. So this drives it pretty far. I mean, we will have an energy budget per square foot that is less than 1/2 of a LEED platinum building. We'll harvest all the rainwater that falls on it and store it in a 50,000-gallon cistern in the basement. We have banned all toxic materials from it, so there are 363 common building elements that we can't have in our building. And on and on. We don't have a garage. We have a huge bicycle garage, and we've sited it so that it's got ample public access to things. And everything that we could think of, FSC certified wood, and on and on. Anything that seems to be what buildings should be, we did. Now, our rate of return on that is going to be probably somewhere between 6% and 8%. If we were a developer, we would be looking for something between 10% and 15%, because when you develop, there's a lot of risk attached to it. So nobody's going to do that unless we do it. But once somebody has done it, once you've built the first Prius, then suddenly everybody starts to take a look at hybrids and figures out different ways to do things. And as the volume grows, then the cost of the photovoltaics become less expensive. As you get more and more FSC certified lumber, then more and more forests will produce it, and it will also fall. So we're paying a premium in order to get this done, and that's an appropriate role for a foundation.
You mentioned that the Earth Day movement started originally thinking it would be focused on students, and it appealed to students and also some older folks. How do you see the role of young people today and the role of students? Do you see them as active? Are they active in a different way? Where do you see that headed?
Well, the change agents in almost every society are young people. If you look at Arab Spring, it's the folks on the streets are young people. If you look at the student revolutions in France or in South America, it's always young people. The civil rights movement in the United States was driven by youth. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the people who were actually out there sticking their necks out, were young people. And the same thing was true of the anti-war movement. It was just overwhelmingly dominated by, and in fact that was what led Senator Nelson to assume that this would be a student thing as well, because they were the people who knew how to organize and to get things done. And both of those had begun on college campuses with teach-ins, and hence it was a reasonable thing to think that that's how this would go as well. The difficulty is that that particular set of students were already fed up with teach-ins. They'd been there, they'd done that, they were ready to act already, whether they knew what they were acting on yet or not. It was just, let's move. Today, we have a generation that has a far superior, just infinitely superior in environmental education than anybody in the country had in the late 1960s. They understand these issues, and I think can be motivated under the right set of circumstances to demand change. There have been various efforts at that, some more successful than others, some involving civil disobedience over climate, others involving youth rallies and conferences and conventions. They look at what's going on inside Washington, D.C. They look at a whole series of decisions that are made by companies whose futures depend upon coal, upon oil shale, upon tar sands, and they don't find much reason for hope. I mean, the most enlightened businessman in the United States and almost anybody's reckoning today is Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett made his biggest single purchase, Burlington Northern, in order to haul coal to China. I mean, where do you see hope in this entire picture? I don't know, we have to get them to be hopeful. They probably have to get themselves. I mean, when you're young, they don't care what guys like me have to say. Somebody has to emerge from within that community that's capable of inspiring them. And then I think we could see electrifying changes.
Well, as a last question, what keeps you moving forward and hopeful for yourself, looking to the future?
It's a little bit like those Christian fundamentalists. It's a leap of faith rather than anything that I can pull out data to show. I mean, in 1980, we had spent a couple $1 million, involved 4 national laboratories, a half dozen universities, and punched out a detailed roadmap with all of the policies that were needed and the technological advances that were needed and the budgets to achieve all of this stuff to make America a very, very efficient country that was obtaining 20% of its energy from renewable resources by the year 2000, and with just a little bit of a fill-up at the end, that was a shift that could have been effectively 100% completed by 2025. I mean, the first 20 years were the hardest. Once you get to 20%, you got some momentum. I knew what I was doing. I knew where we were going. I actually, had Jimmy Carter been re-elected, I think we would be in a profoundly different world today. I mean, that year, the institute that I headed that did this, that coordinated this study, was spending more money, employing more PhDs, obtaining more patents every year than the rest of the world combined. If we'd just been able to keep on that path, others would have started bailing in. America would have been leading this revolution. And at that point, the IBM PC had not yet been introduced. The whole computer revolution was nascent, whereas we had already discovered every single photovoltaic material that's in commercial production any place in the world today, virtually all of it with taxpayers' dollars. I knew where we were going. I knew a way to get there. You know, that was more than 3 decades ago. We are arguably in much worse shape today than we were then. And if you're asking, why are you so hopeful? You know, I have a daughter, and my daughter has a daughter. We've kept our lineage one-on-one. And I cared desperately that she has a good world that she can grow up in, and I'm willing to continue to work to make that happen. Plus, these are things that I really care about and that I'd like to think I've developed some skill on how you move the chess pieces around the board to make progress. So what many people think of as work, where you get up in the morning and you do something you don't much enjoy because somebody will pay you for it because you can then buy some health insurance and some food. I get up every morning and spend my days doing things that I genuinely enjoy, and every now and then, at least in the limited canvas that I get to paint in, have a triumph that makes me feel really good about what we've done, and I can't think of any better way to spend my life.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up, Denis?
I've probably spoken amply, but thanks for the offer.
You've made such an enormous contribution in your career, and as you said, differences kind of show in the evolution of the environmental movement. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us today and for all your efforts.